So I finally played Metroid Other M. In retrospect, I can't believe I waited so long to play this highly unusual and unique game. Other M is a strange experience filled with major highs and lows that I continued contemplating long after I had finished playing. I'm a huge Metroid fan, and at the start of 2023, there were only two Metroid games I hadn't played, including the spin offs, which were Metroid Fusion and Other M. I finally had a chance to play the excellent Metroid Fusion a couple months ago when it was released for Switch Online, so check out my other video for all the details on that. Well, after completing Fusion and realizing what I had missed out on all these years, I was of course inspired to go back and give Other M another look. My experience with the franchise would at least finally be complete, regardless of how much I enjoyed the game. And please remember to hit subscribe to support this type of content. Also, there are some spoilers ahead. Now, I originally sort of avoided Other M back in 2010. To be honest, I never really gave it a fair chance for a few different reasons. I was a deeply loyal fan of the Prime series, and Other M just seemed like a strange detour that didn't quite capture my attention. It really was the Other M for me, that other 3D Metroid game that just didn't appeal to me. For me, the game seemed like sort of a weird combination of ideas that deviated too far from Metroid staples. Subtle exploration seemed to have been replaced almost entirely with a focus on action and melodramatic storytelling. I thought developer Team Ninja was also an odd studio to take on Metroid given their past titles, especially after Retro Studios had done such a fantastic job with the Prime trilogy. The situation also seemed to create some level of community backlash against this game, despite fairly positive critic scores, though it's debatable to what extent. Perhaps most importantly though, my interest in the Wii console itself had really just started to wane several years into the console cycle. I am simply not a fan of motion controls in general, which you know if you've watched any of my other videos, and at this point I was tired of seeing so many major titles shoehorned into strange control mechanics just to showcase motion. I ended up in a similar situation with Skyward Sword in the Wii generation, but eventually really enjoyed that remastered version of the game on Switch. So the combination of beating Metroid Fusion and Skyward Sword left me with sort of a renewed motivation to go out and try the one Metroid game I had never played. The recent release of Metroid Prime Remastered also inspired me to revisit the other 3D Metroids in general and just see how they hold up or how they might transfer to a remastered experience. So I'm here to share my thoughts on how this bizarre game holds up in 2023 and whether it might deserve any type of port or HD remaster on a modern Nintendo console. Since completing the game, I've been dealing with a lot of internal conflict over how much I enjoyed and disliked different parts of this experience, but in the end, I really did have a lot of fun with it. Metroid Other M is designed around an unusual combination of gameplay and story ideas. I've honestly never played anything quite like it, for better and for worse. There are several aspects of this game that really struck me as bizarre right from the beginning, and continued to feel unusual up until the very end. I actually did enjoy this game way more than I thought I would, but I was also left baffled by certain design elements and how they all come together. It's a fun ride through an alternate take on Metroid where all kinds of strange things are possible. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of this game is the control scheme and overall world traversal design. In 2023, it's difficult to even explain what Metroid Other M is without demonstration. It's essentially a 3D action game played with only the Wii remote held horizontally like an old-school controller, no nunchuck attachment allowed. The startup screen even orders you to unplug any accessories. Most of the game is spent in a third-person perspective with a semi-fixed yet dynamic camera the player has no control over. So in practice, Other M essentially kind of plays like a 2D side-scroller set in 3D environments. You're running and gunning through corridors and large arena-like areas with a mixture of free 3D movement and more restricted 2D paths. Occasionally the game even switches to an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective for dramatic moments. At almost any point, you can also rotate the Wii remote and point it directly at the screen to switch into a first-person perspective. In first-person mode, strangely, you cannot move at all. It's just a fixed position view where you can look around using motion aiming in a perspective similar to the Metroid Prime games. So essentially there are 3 different camera perspectives at work in this game at any given time, and all of them have intentional limitations on what you might traditionally expect from those angles. Now, because this game only makes use of the Wii remote, that means you control the entire game without a real joystick, and it's probably why you can't move around in the first-person view. That's right, it's a fast-paced 3D action game controlled entirely by a D-pad. Even for 2010, this is just crazy bizarre and sounds terrible on paper, but honestly, it somehow all works fairly well. Most of the time, sort of. It takes some getting used to and never feels perfect, but it functionally works with the way the game is designed. Metroid Other M makes this setup work by streamlining and automating all kinds of gameplay elements. For example, in third-person mode, all of Samus's arm cannon aiming is handled for you. Samus basically auto-targets whatever closest enemy she's facing. The combat runs at a frantic pace, and the challenge comes from rapidly dodging and maneuvering and spamming beam attacks rather than precision aiming or strategic weapon choice. Samus is fast and nimble, which helps make up for some of the awkwardness of the D-pad. In general, the combat is actually pretty fun. Most of the time, enemies are designed in a way that works for the unusual setup. Honestly, it's also kind of crazy how well Samus can navigate 3D environments with this control setup. The game helps you with traversal in all kinds of ways, whether that's occasionally aligning or locking movement to a 2D path, offering generous timing windows for certain actions such as dodging or grappling, or smartly designing the environments with Samus's clunky moveset in mind. The explorable areas of the different chambers have very simplistic geometric designs, which limits the amount of precise movements required from the player and the simple controls. Team Ninja thankfully designed these areas around Samus's strengths and limitations. Unfortunately though, this can also make many of the rooms somewhat bland. All too often you're just sprinting through mostly empty hallways or jumping around overly simplistic spaces. The environments out of reach beyond the invisible walls of the main paths are more detailed, but the areas where Samus is actually allowed to move are often very simplistic. Occasionally when more nuanced movements are required, that's when things start to break down a bit and become frustrating. The camera works okay for the most part in terms of dynamically framing these environments and the action, considering it is semi-fixed and you have no control over it. However, in general, there is too much running towards the camera in this game, which can feel very awkward. Sometimes you accidentally trip over enemies or miss doors and run into walls because you can't see where you're going. Some surfaces or parts of the environment you can't actually see in third person, and you have to switch into the first person view and then look backwards in the direction of the camera, which is kind of bizarre to think about. You're never able to rotate the third person camera around to see different angles of the environments. However, luckily the game is also designed to be very forward moving without too much backtracking until the end game. I still think it's crazy that this game works at all, much less as well as it does, juggling multiple camera perspectives, frantic action, and a surprisingly wide moveset from Samus, all with just a D-pad and a few buttons. It's certainly not my ideal control setup at all, and I'd never want to see a repeat of it, but once I got used to it, I was surprised that it all came together as well as it did after my initial negative reactions. You just have to get used to some of these quirks and oddities. Strangely enough, I actually found the first-person view of this game to be much more clumsy and awkward than the third-person view. That's especially odd considering you can't even move around in first-person, and we already know from the Prime games that the pointer motion controls can work fine in this perspective. The issue is that Samus herself does not rotate as you move the pointer around unless you hold down the B trigger while moving the pointer in either direction. This wouldn't be too bad, except that B is also the button that you use to scan points in the environment and lock onto enemies to fire missiles. So if you're trying to rapidly turn in first person while also investigating or trying to quickly target an enemy, it can feel very imprecise and clunky. Another quirk is that if you're not holding B and move the pointer around, if you move to the top or bottom of the screen, it cancels out first person mode, but if you move to the left or right edge of the screen, the pointer just stays in place and doesn't cancel out from the view. However, while holding down B, you can look up and down as well as side to side. It's all just very quirky and awkward feeling. This flipping between third and first person views is definitely my biggest issue with the gameplay. In many moments, it does create kind of a cool experience. You're racing around and battling in third person, and then you switch to first person for some more detailed investigative work or to lock on and fire a powerful finishing blast at just the right moment against a major enemy. Switching camera views literally and conceptually changes your perspective on the environment, and that can make for some neat but still simplistic puzzle solving. However, many of the more complicated enemy encounters require you to switch back and forth between these modes rapidly and repeatedly, which can become frustrating or annoying at times. When you flip to first person, sometimes the Wii pointer doesn't end up where you'd like it to be, and you're forced to waste time kind of wiggling the cursor around to rapidly calibrate things. The first person view is also used to line up powerful shots on enemies when they're vulnerable, but sometimes the timing window doesn't feel long enough, especially if you just spent time calibrating, and you're definitely more vulnerable in this perspective. Other enemies can still attack you while you're just standing there. When there are a lot of enemies on screen, this auto lock-on mechanic also just doesn't behave the way you might want, resulting in shooting the wrong thing or missing the timing of an encounter. Sometimes the game also temporarily forces you into first-person mode to investigate and find one specific point in the environment to progress forward. However, it's not always obvious what you're supposed to target or focus on in these detective moments, and that can result in an awkward and lengthy period of just moving the controller around trying to find the intended point of interest. I appreciate all of these creative and unique attempts at interesting gameplay mechanics in Other M, but sometimes it's just too much and feels messy or imprecise. Now, despite my ongoing gripes about motion controls, to my surprise, Other M actually has fairly minimal motion controls in it. Aside from the first-person perspective, there are only a couple other motion-based elements to the game. When you're low on health, you can hold the Wii remote vertically and press the A button to charge up and restore some life and missile ammo. Other M has really frantic combat where things can fall apart pretty quickly, so I actually enjoyed this sort of last chance mechanic. However, when the controller is held horizontally, the A button puts you in morph ball mode, which means if the Wii doesn't immediately recognize the controller is vertical, you can go into a vulnerable morph ball mode instead of recharging your health. This essentially has the opposite effect than intended and can be really annoying. It also further reinforces my frustrations with the imprecise nature of motion controls in tight situations, but I digress. Although the overall Wii Remote setup works, I'm curious to see how this exact same game would play with a more traditional controller. This is one area that should definitely be overhauled in any sort of hypothetical port or remaster. Instead of pointing the Wii Remote towards the screen, you could just use a button to toggle the first-person mode and then aim and lock on with joysticks and buttons. This might be quicker and more precise. And instead of holding the controller vertically to recharge, you could again just use some kind of joystick or button combination. I also really wish you could play this game with an actual joystick instead of a directional pad. It's probably the main reason I would ever want any kind of port or remaster of this game. I think it would make the combat more fluid and world movement more enjoyable. The D-pad on the Wii feels very plasticky and cheap in 2023, and I just hated using it. The fast-paced movement of Samus just seems like such a better fit for a joystick, and you could add in additional levels of sensitivity to movements. The combat of this game is fun and satisfying to play, with constant dodging, charge beam shots, leaping onto enemies, diving finisher moves, and so on. I just wish it could be enhanced with smoother joystick controls. There are occasional moments in this game that make me wonder if a deeper, more traditional Metroid game focused on exploration really could work in third person, or what things might have looked like had Retro not decided on their iconic first-person perspective. This game also randomly made me think a lot about the PS5 game Returnal, because I've always thought that game had the third-person control setup and feel of what I think a 3D Metroid game should play like. Some combination of ideas from Other M and Returnal might work, but I digress. I think I would still greatly prefer the first-person approach going forward. There's a level of immersion offered by that perspective that I just don't think Other M captures quite as well. Even though this game is fun, it does have a little bit of an arcade feel to it, and it's just not a core type of experience I'm looking for from this series. Anyways, the control issues become more noticeable in the more difficult fights of the game. Other M features a lot of bosses, and most of them are actually pretty exciting and enjoyable. They often capture the lethal nature and abilities of Samus as a bounty hunter. Some of these fights do require more precise movements, timing, or toggling between first-person mode, and that's when this unusual control scheme can start to feel frustrating. However, for the most part, the systems are forgiving enough that you can sort of power through it and still have fun. These interesting boss fights really help to keep up the pacing as well. Visually, some of the bosses certainly look better than others, but most of them have at least one unique hook to them to shake things up. I especially liked the aggressive and visually interesting battle against Ridley in this game. even though the story presentation around it is a bit strange, but we'll get to that in a moment. It's also kind of impressive how Nintendo and Team Ninja managed to get most of Samus's usual power-ups working in a 3D game with such limited buttons and control options. Abilities like the grapple beam, screw attack, shine spark, seeker missiles, they're all here, even if they're only available in certain perspectives, and for the most part they actually feel pretty good to use. A lot of this is once again due to the game's generous auto assistance and a stacked approach to power-ups. For example, the Seeker missile just automatically adds additional targets once you lock onto one initial target. The grapple beam has really wide timing windows to prevent mess-ups or frustrations, and the Shine Spark is only used in areas that are also pretty forgiving in terms of timing and direction. These are smart design decisions by the developers that keep the game fun and minimize the ways the controls can sometimes get in their own way, but they also sort of reveal all the limitations and shortcomings of this setup. If a game must hold your hand through so many different aspects of gameplay, there might be some underlying issues going on. All of these abilities are used to traverse the various environments as much as they are to battle enemies, and for the most part, Other M is fun to explore, if you can call it that. The game is highly linear, but the environments do have secrets and optional power-ups scattered around. I enjoyed a bit of backtracking at the end of the game to collect more of these power-ups. Finding them is usually simple, since by then they're all marked on the map, so it's a bit of a trade-off between a steady stream of rewards versus robbing you of a sense of discovery. Hardcore players might find this hand-holding a bit much or disappointing, while others might say it's consistent with the streamlined, fast-paced nature of this game. Anyway, I was pleasantly surprised by the graphical variety on display as you explore. Initially, I thought everything would just look like a bland spaceship interior of some sort. In many ways, the structure of this game reminded me a lot of the superior Metroid Fusion. The entire game does take place on a space station, but there's holographic or simulated environments that add variety beyond just metal and corridors. You travel between different sectors to accomplish objectives with a mixture of combat and very light puzzle solving and environmental investigation. Like Fusion, this game actually has great pacing once it gets going, though it's even more linear and the beginning is bogged down by too many cinematics. Cutscenes throughout the game tend to be overly long in general, but we'll get to that later. For the most part, it rolls along at a good pace for its 7 to 10 hour core duration, with plenty of boss fights, new environments, and power-ups along the way. Graphically, these environments are a bit all over the place. Some of them look quite good for a Wii game and are impressive in scale. They even hold up fairly well when switching to first-person mode. However, other areas are somewhat bland and lack detail and visual interest. Texture work is usually very low resolution or blurry across the board, but that's pretty typical of Wii games. There are plenty of cool looking weapons and environmental effects scattered throughout. I don't think this game looks quite as inspired or detailed as really any of the Metroid Prime games, but it does pack a lot of style and interesting moments. For example, one sector features certain forest or jungle looking areas, but none of those spots look anywhere near as detailed as what we saw in the Torvus Bog or the Talon overworld of Metroid Prime 1 and 2, which were also built for the technically inferior GameCube hardware. As another example, the Other M desert area is fun to play through, but again does not look as detailed as the Agon Wastes. It's difficult not to make these comparisons when all the Prime games are also playable on Wii, but I do like that Other M has its own style. The game does a decent job of establishing a certain atmosphere or mood that remains consistent over the entire experience. At times I felt a real sense of tension or gravity. Overall, the environments look fine and are fun to play through, even if most of them aren't that memorable when compared to other Metroid games. The stylistic approach to the world design also extends to perhaps the most controversial aspect of this entire game, which is the cinematic story presentation. Metroid Other M is by far the most story-heavy Metroid game out there. There are a couple of hours of cinematics in this game with full voice acting and extensive animation, using both pre-rendered graphics for pivotal moments and game engine graphics throughout. Many fans were turned off by this aspect of the game, while some seem to enjoy at least some elements of the deeper perspectives on Samus and the Galactic Federation. The story follows Samus on a mission to investigate a derelict space station broadcasting a distress call. Upon arriving, it's clear that all is not well. Samus and a collection of Federation soldiers, some of whom she has history with, must spread out and explore the ship to find answers. Now, personally, I did not really enjoy the story presentation or cinematics of this game. I think Samus is represented somewhat poorly and awkwardly as sort of a brooding individual struggling to come to terms with certain relationships and past traumas.
The word he so obviously chose, outsider, pierced my heart.
I always imagined her more assertive and quiet and sure of herself, whereas in this game she frequently shows self doubt, a desire for approval from her father figure Adam, or even fear and panic in some situations.
What's your status?
You can't be!
Samus, do you read me?
Now, you could argue this humanizes her character, and there are some elements of that work, but I think the overall delivery is just kind of underwhelming and one note. It undermines a character who's supposed to be an unstoppable bounty hunter and who appears fearless in the other games. It also doesn't help that she constantly gets ordered around by the Federation throughout the entire game, despite repeatedly insisting that she's an independent bounty hunter. There's also an extremely dumb plot contrivance where Samus isn't allowed to use certain abilities until the Federation gives permission.
As far as your other weapons go, we will continue to investigate and authorize use as we can.
This is a very odd design choice that creates all kinds of weird situations. As one example, Samus travels to a molten lava area that is so hot that she takes damage just from being there. Even then, she isn't allowed to enable her Varia suit function for heat protection until Adam says so. You also pass doors locked by super missiles and other power-ups that Samus already has equipped, but you can't open the door until you have permission to use that tool. Why Samus would be forbidden from opening doors when she's specifically there to investigate is beyond me. Other odd reasons like concerns of collateral damage are given as reasons to not use items like the power bomb, which is also strange when you consider the ship is basically abandoned and already extensively damaged. Some power-ups you do acquire naturally throughout your journey, so it's odd that they weren't all just applied this way somehow. The entire main plot of this game revolves around weapons research development, so it's not a reach to think that Samus could have just adapted new power-ups from findings throughout the ship. Late in the game, the plot also takes some unexpected and kind of bizarre turns and covers a lot of big ideas in a short amount of time. Everything from planted assassins to AI androids developing feelings to bioweapons to genetic modifications and rebirths of past enemies, there's a lot going on here. It's all a bit convoluted and at times feels very messy and a bit silly. I wish the story were a little more grounded or focused. Many of the cinematics also have kind of a strange lighting filter that gives them a really hazy, almost dreamlike look, which further adds to the sort of eclectic nature of the story. Some of the cinematics actually are dreamlike flashbacks, but even some of the ones in the present just kind of have this strange lighting and filtering. Although I didn't enjoy many of the cutscenes, I do think they mostly fit the overall mood or style of the game, and at least don't feel too disconnected from the core gameplay experience. Samus also often narrates the story herself and explains things that just happened as though the developers know that it's sort of confusing or requires leaps in logic or additional context. The quality of Samus's voice acting is sort of hit or miss and varies a lot between these scenes. The narrated portions have kind of a very slow-paced, low-energy vibe to them that is supposed to sound mysterious or contemplative, but instead it kind of just drags and is a bit boring.
Never again would I encounter the baby. Never. The finality of it struck me once again.
During some of the faster conversations or more dramatic scenes, the acting is often much better.
You have to trust me. You have to trust me. Just give me a chance.
Samus.
Some of these cutscenes are also surprisingly lengthy, and from what I could tell, they're never skippable. Most of them use in-engine graphics, which do get the job done impressively well for a Wii game, but aren't especially interesting to look at since they're often essentially just Galactic Federation soldiers talking in metal corridors and rooms. There are a few well-done story beats and cinematic moments here and there, and a few of the voice actors do a decent enough job, but overall I just didn't find the story approach that compelling. I just wanted to get back to the really quirky but addicting gameplay, and I hope future games return to a more subdued approach. I will say that from a strictly technical perspective, most of these cinematics do feature much stronger animation than what we saw in the other Wii Metroid game, Metroid Prime 3, which also went for a more cinematic story. The overall movement, facial animation, and visual quality of these cinematics, both pre-rendered and in-game, is easily among the best on the Wii. I just wish the story driving them was more coherent and compelling. I think a few elements of the story could have been given more depth while removing other elements entirely. In another one of my videos about whether Metroid Prime 3 should get a remaster, I spoke extensively about how I don't think the cinematics of that game are high enough quality to translate naturally to enhanced graphics. However, in the case of Other M, I think most of these actually would hold up pretty well with overhauled visuals, such as higher res textures and more detailed character models. So at the end of the day, despite all of its unusual shortcomings, I still enjoyed my time with Metroid Other M. The combat and gameplay is frantic and fast-paced and often quite fun, with plenty of interesting moments along the way. There are some cool boss battles and plenty of unique mechanics. The game literally and figuratively provides entirely new perspectives on what a Metroid game could be. However, the experience is also bogged down by a truly bizarre control scheme, lengthy and sometimes awkward cinematics, a nagging feeling of simplicity in the world design due to control limitations, and plenty of gameplay band-aids to sort of smooth over the experience and make all these pieces work together. Other M substitutes subtle depth, exploration, and polish for hard-hitting action, melodramatic storytelling, and all kinds of experimental gameplay mechanics. In some ways, it all works well enough and actually really comes together in a stylized jumbled mess of fun. In other ways, it just made me miss the strong vision and polished execution of the Prime games and other Metroid titles. I recommend playing Other M if you haven't already, but only if you approach it with an open mind and very limited expectations of what a 3D Metroid should be. Personally, I don't think we'll ever see a remaster of this game based on its popularity and sales, and I honestly don't think it needs one, definitely not anything on the level we saw with Metroid Prime Remastered. I think there's a very slim possibility of a simple up-resed port while Nintendo is in the mindset of porting Metroid games, but in reality, I really doubt it. I would much rather see those development resources allocated to the other Prime games or even some other Nintendo gems. However, in the unlikely event that it does happen, I would certainly welcome a lightly revamped port with sharpened up graphics, skippable cutscenes, and a buttons-only control scheme with a real controller. I think that package would further cement this game's legacy as a highly flawed but intriguing alternate reality take on what a 3D Metroid could be. I certainly never want another game in the series to follow the formula of Other M, but at the same time, I'm kind of glad it exists, if only to serve as a fun and interesting detour from games of greater substance and more polished delivery. Metroid Other M somehow manages to be memorable not by delivering a flawlessly executed experience and powerful vision, but rather from daring to attempt something unique and different with the formula of a long-running franchise. Even though it doesn't always succeed, I enjoyed the interesting ride. Thanks for watching, and please hit subscribe if you enjoyed this content.